Does she seek an off-ramp? Does Pierre Poilievre cut her off if she doesn't seek an off-ramp? This is part of the pivot.
Great to see all of you. Thanks for joining.
Wow.
Happy to
How's
be
it going,
here.
Kathleen?
Hey, first timer, Heather. Thanks.
Yeah, great to get the invite.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So I just want to start with, do you think Ford's Captain Canada narrative is winning over Smith's Captain Alberta? Gary?
Look, I think it was interesting to talk about Team Canada, and I know that Premier Ford has said some things about the Premier of Alberta not signing on to their communique, but I think that Premier Eby had a really great response. He says, look, it's not a precondition that everybody has to sign on to this communique to be part of Team Canada. And he said, quite graciously, Premier Smith is working in the best interests of the people of her province. And we would expect all premiers to be doing such things. And so when you look at the disproportionate impact on the GDP that an embargo on oil and gas coming out of Alberta would have on the economy, she's standing up for it. So I don't think it's a question of Doug Ford or Danielle Smith. I think both are trying to do the best that they can. And for those that have ever been in a Council of the Federation meeting, they'd be astonished with two things. One is how much premiers know, and two, how much they work on behalf of their respective constituents in their provinces. I would expect that Premier Holt of New Brunswick would be working very strongly on the issues relating to fish and fish products exported to New Brunswick. I would expect that Premier Ford, of course, would be focused on the auto sector. Collectively, we will come to some solutions, but let's not light our hair on fire just yet, because we don't even know, one, how deep these tariffs are going to be, two, what their motivation is, three, we don't know how long they're going to last.
I know, but then the question becomes, when we don't know any of that, why do we take one of our most persuasive levers off the table so publicly, Heather?
I don't know the answer to that. And for me, I've been very supportive of Smith in the last few weeks. I think she has smart people around her. I think what they're trying to do with the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission is very smart. I agree with her goal to try to double oil and gas. But I would take and I don't understand the strategy behind taking off our best card. And I thought about it this way is, I support oil, and a big part of that is because it's in a national interest. And I think it's important that a country like Canada is a big oil and gas player in the world. Energy is power. And this is the week not to defend oil, but for oil to defend us. And she's taken the opposite strategy of taking oil off the table at this point. And I get your, to your point, Gary, this wouldn't be in our interest. It would be a huge burden on Alberta. We aren't making a decision on that today. We are saying, what are the cards that we're going to put on the table? And I think it's premature to be taking cards off the table.
But I would expect that at this meeting, they would have talked about, well, actually, even if you did do an export ban, will it make a difference? The United States has a huge strategic petroleum reserve. They can last for months without the use of foreign oil. Number two, if American consumers are annoyed and attract their ire because they're paying, instead of $3 a gallon for gasoline, they're paying $4 a gallon, then why would you displace the anger that it would be directed at the president-elect or then president of the United States and replace it with Canada being your bad guy?
I get the argument against the substance of the lever, but I'm talking more about the politics and the rhetoric behind it when you have, the way you put it, Heather, I thought it was so interesting. We're not saying don't defend oil, we're saying that oil can defend us. And she can't actually take that off the table, by the way, because if they choose to go that route, they can, right? She can't really stop them.
They being the feds. No, absolutely right. And on the politics, right, Gary makes a compelling case, a persuasive case. I can even add to that case in terms of, Alberta's energy importance to the rest of the country, the fact that we really only have one consumer for it with the way our infrastructure is set up. So she might be right, but it's not a winning strategy. the winning strategy here, as you've talked about both on the levers that are presented and the cards, as Heather has said, that are on the table, that we present to the Americans in a unified way, has to be the Canadian approach. It has to. Because if we're taking it off the table, it opens up more political questions about Danielle Smith, including some extremely harsh questions that have been circulating right now around, is she compromised? What did she get from Trump at Mar-a-Lago? Why is she doing this? It opens up why she wasn't there in person. The politics for Danielle Smith, both from a negotiating perspective for the rest of the country, as well as Alberta, which, by the way, as much as energy is a huge part of this place, let's not forget it's not the only part of this place. A carve-out for energy does damage other industries. It's both strategically a poor move on Danielle Smith's part, but the politics domestically aren't a slam dunk. I know there's many that would say, look at her. She's fighting for energy. She's fighting for Alberta. That is the singular thing she should be doing. But let's not forget the vast majority of Albertans in polling consider themselves, just like the rest of the country, to be Canadians first. And when you have extremely talented, persuasive, and ideologically like-minded politicians like Ford and Moe saying, I'm Canadian first, Danielle Smith finds herself on an island alone. And that might sound like a great vacation, but it's never a great vacation when you're a castaway.
Gary?
Well, I guess I would say that it probably reflects the fact that Team Canada sometimes resolves itself to being Team Central Canada. And that I think that some Albertans, and I think the Premier, is of the view that Western Canadian interests are sometimes cast about fairly cavalierly by Eastern Canadians. So as an example, to support the EV industry, and to be lockstep with the United States, 100% tariffs were placed on Chinese electric vehicles.
Right.
How did the Chinese retaliate? They retaliated by, putting restrictions on Canadian canola. Did anybody in Ontario care that this trade-off was made? No, but was agriculture thrown under the bus in favor of manufacturing in Ontario? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
And this is part of a long history. So I can understand why the Premier has taken the position that she's taken. Because that's, where we stand depends on where we sit, and that's her perspective.
In that recent private members bill, trying to take supply management off the table in any future trade negotiations, I don't think it's a perfect comparison, but it sort of speaks to what you're talking about.
Gary's not wrong about Alberta being screwed over even by this federal government with pieces of legislation. And I say this as the quote-unquote progressive person on the panel with NDP and progressive roots. So Gary's not wrong about that. But the question I have is this the context, and is this the time to dust off the same old playbook and go after the libs in Ottawa when you have a dozen premiers standing behind not the Liberal government but the Prime Minister in this country? The frame has changed, and Danielle Smith's playbook has not. And I think that's the concern here, because it's a playbook that works 9 times out of 10. This is that 10th time.
Yeah, I would say, so there's 2 strategies to play. One is with Trump, and I think, people need to appreciate this. We sent them a record amount of oil last week, 4.4 million barrels a day. No country has ever imported more oil than the United States imported from oil last week from Canada. So that's a huge card. But then there's a strategy on the domestic side. And if you take her at her word that her goal is to double Alberta oil and gas production, and I do, and I would share that goal, then there needs to be a domestic strategy to achieve that. Regardless of whether you want Alberta to separate or not, we are not. We are part of Canada. You need to negotiate with other provinces to get that done. We were so on the verge. If you could say, let's use the umbrella of oil to protect all of you. This is Canada's oil. It's good for all of us. I saw the goodwill and you're saying, yeah, we were wrong on Keystone. We were wrong on Energy East. We were wrong on Northern Gateway. I saw that outside of Alberta. And I feel like we are on the cusp of really getting that public support, that critical mass. Poilievre's using pipelines against Carney, obviously because it's important.
By the way, those pipelines were stymied during the Harper administration.
Well, we can talk about that, but those are still the pipelines we want. You still want to get the goodwill for those from the rest of Canada. And I feel like being the odd man out, being, the 13th,
and I called it the administration. I meant government. You see how the extent to which Trump is permeating the conversation. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
I would
Carry
just
on.
say that we are closer to achieving we were closer to getting the political goodwill domestically 5 days ago than we are today.
I agree with that completely. There was a pathway here in order for Danielle Smith, and perhaps alongside folks like Fury and Mo and other provinces who are supportive of energy production, to bring up how historically Quebec and other provinces have been standing in our BC has been standing in our way to do stuff. But instead, we now stand alone with minimal leverage rather than actually uniting Canada and making a point to say, if I sign on this, it means that going forward in the future, we got to do big things, because look at the problem we're in right now that you have to do this. And I know it's not a pipelines overnight solution, but at least it could bind this country together around something that this province has for a long time, regardless of what political tattoo any of us wear, have been universally advocating for.
I found it interesting yesterday. I was listening to James Moore on Power and Politics, and former Harper cabinet minister, speaking of the Harper government. And he made an interesting point, Gary, that I'd be curious to hear your response to. I know you're on PNP. I don't know if you heard this, but essentially what he said was that Danielle Smith shouldn't have been put in the position to feel like she couldn't sign on to the communique in the first place. In other words, the statement should not have included that as being sort of, it didn't in the text, but it was understood that that was part of the arsenal, and that it should have been a communique that she could have signed.
I think that's an interesting perspective, because if you started listing specific things like 90% of the potash used in the United States is exported to them, and almost all of it comes from Saskatchewan. Had you listed potash specifically as something just like oil and gas was listed, maybe Premier Moe wouldn't have been prepared to sign off.
Well, they didn't really list anything, let's be honest, right?
This
That
was all about
communique was super vague.
what's on the table. Sort of thing.
It was just everything's on the table,
Right,
and that
right.
would include.
She made that decision before that meeting was.
Well,
over.
and we knew that was her position, right? She made it very clear
and
that
her
was always her
communication
position.
was ready to go as soon as was announced she wasn't on the letter. Sorry, Gary.
Yeah.
Well, so I think Honourable Moore makes a pretty good point. All of that could have been discussed in advance and agreed to in camera, and not talked about in public.
You usually agree on these things ahead of time, right?
Exactly.
Like you
Exactly right.
come up with a statement, then you meet, but you already know going in that everyone's on side.
There's something also to be said. I'll just add into the mix, and this is not an original thought of my own, but it was mentioned by someone else, which is she wasn't in the room. We know that. But if she were in the room, would she have had more persuasive ability on folks like Mo and others to be able to make that point? Every time, and there's the dynamics, the psychological dynamics, and we've all experienced this in our lives. If that one person on the call or not in the meeting before or after, or not in the hallway before or after, that has an impact. And so I wonder if Smith's actual fundamental goal was persuasion of her point, even for one or two other premiers, so she wasn't a castaway on an island alone. If it would have helped her if she wasn't on a virtual call.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is, it was a failure, and it looks most poorly on Alberta, but it looks a little bit poorly on all of Canada when we're in the middle of a negotiation. So I do wonder how did that happen? How did it get to that point? When did it break down? When was it clear that Alberta wouldn't be signing on? But, the fact that Mo did sign on, and they have, from their own perspective,
And
almost
Fury.
as much. Yes, almost, and all of them, but Mo and Smith are, quite similar
Cousins in the
politically, and
ideologically,
have been saying he's been saying the same things about uranium and potash, and not to mention 500,000 barrels of oil. By the way, the fact that he signed on and Smith didn't, that does that does say that there's something bigger here that was at stake than we should have thought about all 13 premiers and before this happened.
I've been to First Ministers conferences. I've been to federal, provincial, territorial meetings, and I have this recollection from 25 years ago working with François Legault and Poilievre when I was education minister, when I was health minister, and often our communiques as an FPT would have an asterisk saying except Quebec. So there would be agreement on certain things, and then there would be the asterisk that said except Quebec. So
that's us now?
Well, I guess the Alberta government has taken the trademarked asterisk and used it to their purposes.
But the problem is the extent to which I don't know, the alignment with the U.S. and Trump is sort of another sort of problematic part of this. If you take a look at the post, I know you're not on X, because you and I have discussed this, Gary. but if you take a look at the post that Premier Smith sent out as they were having the news conference and confirming, this was on Wednesday, that Premier Smith was not signing on to any of this. You take a look at the graphic she posted. She combined the Stars and Stripes, the U.S. flag, with the Canadian flag, but her bold message completely obscured the maple leaf, right? Which was no Ottawa tariffs on Alberta energy exports. So really, almost all you could see was the American flag, number one. And number two, she was suggesting this was all Ottawa and not all the other provinces and territories.
Right. It's the same old playbook that she's had. She's had the anti, and it works here. Of course, it works here. This is the 10 out of 10 situation where it doesn't, right? And listen, on the design side, that's just poor design. I'm just going to chalk that up to someone being
but
not
design
on...
matters.
No, of course it does.
The imagery matters.
I work in design. The Mark Carney logo yesterday, not great. The Danielle Smith thing, not great. Okay, a bad week for design and politics. I'll chalk it up to that. However, the larger point remains, though, and I think that's the interesting one, which is I think in retrospect, as excited as anyone in this province may have been that there was a picture of our premier with Donald Trump saying, wow, like look at the access that she got. And I'll be honest, I was one of those people that initially was like, holy crap, like how did Danielle Smith get this sort of access? And then you find out what happened. And,
Kevin O'Leary.
Right. But you're like, that's interesting.
And by the way,
that's not a small
thing. To her credit, for all the things that Kevin O'Leary says that we can pay attention to or not, the one thing he did say, which doesn't surprise me and rings true to me, is she really knows how to work a room.
It doesn't surprise me either. But the fact that Kevin O'Leary is arguing for an economic union between Canada and the U.S. also is problematic, and that's the person that got her into the door with Donald Trump. That has not aged well. That visit has not aged well because now you ask the questions of like what happened at Mar-a-Lago? What is she trying to do with MAGA? What sort of relationship is she trying to build? Is she selling out Canada? Is she selling out Alberta? And I'm not just asking these questions to be controversial. These are the type of questions that lead to when you don't sign the communique, are away on Zoom in Panama, which is rich considering what Trump has said about Panama as well. It opens up this line of questioning that sounds quasi-conspiratorial, but is legitimate because there's no real answers to any of them.
Now, I think she's a bit of a victim of her own success because Alberta did have probably the most sophisticated strategy to negotiate with the United States, has been paving the way for this for a year, and has executed. And the fact she's been able to get on Fox News, able to get to Mar-a-Lago, they've had an excellent ground game. And so, but in fairness to her, she's not the only politician kind of trumping a North American alliance here. Wilkinson was in D.C. this week saying that we should have a Canada-U.S. economic alliance. Ford says every day we should have Fortress,
AmCam, he calls it.
Yeah. So this is not an Alberta thing to have a strategy of negotiating with the United States. But I agree with you. There's certainly a perception, whether you agree with it or not. The perception was raised as being the one province not signing on to the statement. Legitimate questions, I would say, may be raised on which side, not where her loyalties lie, but to what extent is this a Team Canada approach and to what extent isn't it?
Well, I'll say this about Mar-a-Lago, though. I mean, lots of people have said, well, she didn't get anything out of it. But,
well, we don't know what she got.
Well, we don't know.
Or what she sold.
But it's all speculation. But
that's the point.
But I would say that, it is about building a relationship. I mean, I think it's important that you lay the groundwork. You may not like President Trump. You may not like Kevin O'Leary, but the ability to have access and start to build a relationship, I never expected, and I don't think anybody should have expected, that she'd come away from that meeting and say, tariffs are off. In fact, the opposite. She says, we should expect tariffs. Again, the issue will be how long, how deep, and how broad will those tariffs be. And I think it's important to understand what the motivation should be. So, for example, the U.S. trade deficit vis-a-vis all of its partners around the world is $1.1 trillion. Canada, it's about 60. And if you take energy out of the picture, actually the U.S. has a pretty healthy trade surplus vis-a-vis Canada. And I think what part of the motive, for President Trump on these tariffs is he's not negotiating with Canada, he's negotiating through Canada. And what I mean by that is he's saying, look, if I'm prepared to do this to my best trade partner, imagine what I'm going to do to you, China which has a $300 billion trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States, or any one of a number of other countries. And he is looking to find leverage with other countries, and he's putting Canada up.
But where do we find solace in that? Like, even if that's what he's doing, we're still getting hit by the shrapnel on the way through to China.
Well, but I would say this. We got to do something to satisfy snack tooth while he prepares for his main course in China.
Just one final point on Smith for me, because I do agree with Gary on quite a bit of what he said there regarding her positioning and what Heather said around building relationships. I just wish she hadn't done this as a freelance, I'm just going to go out and defend Alberta, right? Like
Ford was freelancing. I mean,
Ford was leading an official like, was he freelancing by going to Mar-a-Lago, meeting with the president, and not having any sort of
he
TikTok?
didn't get to Mar-a-Lago, but I mean, doing all the media, the U.S. media.
Sure, but I think there's something to be said about what Smith is trying to do, and I wish that this was directed from a centralized script, because what I do agree with is that Danielle Smith, with her particular ideology and her particular ability to build connections, can be extremely useful to the broader Canadian context. Who she's trying to be useful for now is the broader Alberta context, which is undercutting the Canadian context.
I'll just build on Gary's point about even the likelihood of the tariffs and who and what it would be applied to. Because I do, I still am in the camp, and I think the oil sector and the conventional wisdom in the markets is still that it's not likely, certainly not likely to be 25% on Canadian energy, and say it were that it would not last long, because that is not something that they can displace. They want to displace manufacturing in China with tariffs and with reducing the currency value, but they cannot do that with Canadian energy, and I think they know that. So I want to make the point that the biggest volatility, the biggest shock to Canadian oil stocks this week was Danielle Smith's comment that when she came back from Mar-a-Lago, that she doesn't expect that there won't be tariffs. She expects that there will, and we had to do everything to protect it. Again, that was a more alarmist comment than almost anything else we've seen in the last week, and that did shake the value of stocks. Anyways, it just, that in trying to protect oil and gas, maybe that was the thing that caused the most volatility this week.
Let's talk a bit about Pierre Poilievre, because I don't know if any of you watched his availability yesterday. He was asked repeatedly about how he viewed what Danielle Smith had decided, and how he viewed what her big objection was, which was the idea that everything was on the table, including the restriction of oil exports into the U.S., whether it's via an export tax or just cutting off supply, and he clearly was not prepared to answer that. Right? He went to pipelines. Right? He talked about
3 times, argued with the CP on the technicality of a question, being like, "I don't understand what you mean by tariffs. We don't." I don't know why he's not given the simple answer. What has he got to lose here in Alberta? Like, there's only one answer to this question for Pierre Poilievre, and this is the first time I've seen him flat-footed in a couple of years, if I'm being truly honest. And so this is actually quite dangerous for him, because he needs to answer this and wrap himself up in the Team Canada flag. And if he doesn't do so and looks at all like someone who would undercut that sort of notion, he's got a world of hurt coming from him politically. Let's not also forget. And a world of hurt, what does that mean, Zain, in context when he's got a 25-point lead? That's shrinking. But let's not also forget, on the raw politics of it, he's also lost another thing this week. The carbon tax election that he's wanted very well may not be a carbon tax election, with Liberals killing the carbon tax themselves, axing the tax themselves with the 2 frontrunners in this race. So Pierre Poilievre's had a rough week, and it's a week that is going to be interesting to see going forward if he can pivot. Well, how good of a pivoter is Pierre Poilievre? Because he's been unbelievable, historically great at being on one track for the last 2 years and building political success out of it. Now he's got to do some tight maneuvering. I'm curious to see if him and Jenny Byrne have got the skills to do it.
I'm going to remind people. Let me just. I'll let you jump in, but I just want to remind people what Justin Trudeau said about this, because he clearly saw the opportunity and the ability to wedge, right? And quote, either he stands up to fight for all Canadians, he's talking about Poilievre, alongside all premiers and the federal government that are doing that, or he chooses to stand with Danielle Smith, Kevin O'Leary, and ultimately Donald Trump. Effective as a wedge, Gary?
I think that would be accurate. But I wanted to point out this piece.
What would be accurate?
Well, that it does create a wedge. It is an effective wedge.
Okay.
So I'd agree with that. I was listening to The Current with Matt Galloway, and he did an interview with Gerald Butts the other day. It was really, really good. And Butts said that the very characteristics that brought Justin Trudeau to the premiership and going from 15% to having a majority government is kind of like a Shakespearean character, because the characteristics that brought him to the premiership are the very same characteristics that brought him down back to about, a sub 20% party. So he's risen and then gone back down. And one wonders if there is a lesson for Pierre Poilievre to recognize the things that made you the leader of the opposition and have brought you great political success. Can you pivot, to Zain's point, can you pivot to show that you got a different gear so that what brought you up doesn't bring you back down at the same time?
Yeah, Heather?
I mean, I reject the idea that Carney and Freeland abandoning a carbon tax is bad for the Conservatives and bad for Poilievre. It demonstrates the success that they've had in their messaging, and there will be a lack of trust in Carney and Freeland advocated for this for a long time. They were associated with it. So to flip-flop now, I don't think looks good on them. But in terms of can he pivot, I don't think it's that, for me, the mega narrative is still, we focus too much on climate, and now we need to focus on economic development, which is the message in a lot of European governments and also of Trump also. And so an extension of that, which he used in that interview, was to say we need to unleash our resources, we need to build more pipelines, we need to have market access, we need to change the permitting system and the regulatory system so that we can build these things. That to me is all consistent, and it's still a winning message.
Yeah, except that's not what he was asked about. I mean,
I thought, maybe I was
as
impressed.
a dodge,
I was impressed that, if you're a journalist, I wouldn't be impressed. If you're a Canadian just watching clips, I think it was an effective dodge.
But don't you think he should, yes, I obviously have a view on this as a journalist. I like politicians to answer the questions that are asked, and they almost never do, let's be honest, right? They dodge, they reframe, they answer the question they wish they had been asked. Nevertheless, he was asked 3 times. And I do think it's important that the leader of the opposition and the person who is best positioned to become the next prime minister, based on the polling that we're seeing, should be able to answer a question about what he's willing to put on the table or off the table in responding to Donald Trump and his threat of tariffs, don't you?
I do agree with that, yes. And I think Danielle Smith put him in a poor position.
Yeah, and the question is, how long does he stay in that position? How long does she weigh him down as an anchor? Does she seek any off-ramp to try to rectify? Because this is, as much as people might think this is great for her in Alberta, I am very skeptical that it purely is going to be upside for her in this province. The fact is, so many people in this province see themselves as Canadians before they see themselves as Albertans at an 80-20, which is, by the way, 10% less than the rest of the country, which is like a 90-10 split. But at the end of the day, this is not going to be pure upside for Danielle Smith. So how does she seek an off-ramp? Does Pierre Poilievre cut her off if she doesn't seek an off-ramp? This is part of the pivot. He hasn't had to deal with something like this in a while. He hasn't been wedged into a corner in a really long time. And now you have premiers, including ideological brethren like Doug Ford and others, who are weighing into the Captain Canada so aggressively. And of course, let's not, be naive about it. Doug Ford's probably going to trigger an election very shortly on this exact question.
I think the checks are going out today. The checks
are going out today.
Ontarians.
I could see Doug Ford calling an election, Tuesday, Wednesday? Like I would not be surprised at all. So he's got political upside of his own, but you've got all these premiers getting both a bump and spending capital on the Canada message, and you got Pierre Poilievre potentially, taking this boat to Castaway Island with Danielle Smith and having to decide, do I go there?
You love this Castaway Island.
I feel like I'm killing it with it. I'm killing it with it. I feel like I'm really angling to get the podcast titled that, Kathleen, because I know you use something that's been said as a title. So
Indeed.
I'm really trying to get that out. But I think that is his struggle. And that is his struggle right now, which is he's got to make some strategic choices. And I don't think this is a difficult one for him, which is why I'm really confused why he's taking so long and why he dodged the question 3 times. I don't see the downside he has to say, wrap myself in the flag, I'm with Canada exclusively, this is where I'm at, everything should be on the table.
Well, it obviously is a difficult one for him. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise
I don't know
he would have responded, right?
So
we got to figure out why he finds it difficult. That's the question. Why does he find this difficult, Gary?
He could be wrong sometimes. This is what I'm saying. It's about pivoting well.
I think Zain's right. It's about the ability to pivot. I mean, all successful politicians have the ability. I mean, I think back to my time with Ralph Klein saying, well, okay, I threw out a trial balloon, didn't work, I'm going in a different direction. And he has the right to be wrong. And learning is allowed when it comes to politics. So we'll see if there is the ability on the part of politicians to be able to navigate this very choppy waters on their way to on or off Castaway Island, I'd say.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you.
Oh, look. Oh, no. Now we just have to wait for Heather to use it. And
we talk about Wilson the volleyball, and we're there. We're at the Tom Hanks movie.
Well, actually, I note that the original boat from Gilligan's Island is now in Nanaimo and has been restored, so maybe they can use
Why do you know stuff like that?
I don't know. It's just I'm a cornucopia of useless trivia. Look, I think that there's still a way for us to navigate through this, and I think there's still goodwill among premiers of Canada working with Premier Smith and to others, and I think we'll muddle our way through this. How about that? And really, we'll have to figure out all of this in scenarios that the federal government should have been focused on last summer. Right? I mean, I don't think I'm wrong on that, but I mean, it was entirely plausible that Donald Trump was going to become the president of the United States again, and we saw what his playbook was in the Project 2025. We know what the writers like Peter Navarro and folks like Robert Lighthizer were writing for him. This was all predictable, and now we find ourselves scrambling in a very short period because, frankly, the Liberal Party of Canada and its leader in particular have been more focused in the last year on their personal interests ahead of that of the country, in my view.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty broad consensus that is indeed the case. I mean, it's really a mess.
Well, especially acutely right now. As good of that wedge issue line that Trudeau put on the table for Poilievre is, it's also rich coming from him on the country first stuff against Danielle Smith when we're now faced with the Liberal leadership race, when we could have actually had someone seek a mandate to actually go up against Trump.
I want to touch on something else that you mentioned, and I want to put it to Heather, which is, I mean, Danielle Smith is a populist leader, so was Ralph Klein, largely, right? He was like the king of trial balloons and then popping them when they didn't float or transcend. But do we know because Gary, you and I did an open line this week, right? Because I do an open line show for CBC as well. And the view is mixed on what people thought about Danielle Smith. I mean, some certainly supported it. But I am wondering, she's a populist. Is this popular? Like, do you think her position, Heather?
Well, it's popular with her base. That's for sure. It's popular, I would say, with the UCP base. I don't know that it's popular with Alberta for the reasons you described before. We're still, Alberta may be, less Team Canada than the rest of Canada, but it was still 80 to 100, vis-a-vis Trump. And even in myself, maybe other people feel the same way. We've all felt a sense of nationalism and patriotism, I think, in Canada after being, provoked to be the 51st state than probably we were feeling 2 months ago. So no, I think it's very popular with her base, and which has a lot of overlap with the conservative base. And that's why it's such a difficult, position for Poilievre. It's not a mystery to me why it's hard for him to pivot on that. There's a lot of overlap between his base and the UCP base. But do I think it's popular with the Canadians and Albertans? No, I don't. And how do I know that? Because Nenshi, Trudeau, Freeland, Carney are already using it as a wedge. They clearly don't think that it's popular, and then they can make some hay out of it.
But how did we find ourselves in this situation of putting ourselves in corners to begin with? I mean, if you look at the response of, the president of Mexico, President Sheinbaum, when he sort of threw out, when the president-elect threw out the idea of tariffs against Mexico, she said, well, two can play that game. And that's all she said. We hardly hear anything now, and I try and follow what goes on in the media vis-a-vis Mexico. And basically, I mean, she learned a lesson from 2016 when President Trump said, we're going to build a wall and you're going to pay for it. And A, a wall wasn't built, and B, Mexico didn't pay a nickel or peso for it. So I think that there was an important lesson in saying, you know what, let's focus on real issues, not these bombastic statements that the president-elect makes. which has been part of his playbook since he was in business, and reading The Art of the Deal will tell you about all that. And so we overreacted. The idea that we would be the 51st state. I mean, I would say, okay, all right, we'll give you New Brunswick, we'll take Hawaii. I mean, we could have made light of it and just left it. We didn't have to react to it the way that we did. So I think that kind of emotional response has taken attention away from what the real issues that we should be dealing with vis-a-vis our largest trading partner in the United States.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have made that point. I hear what you're saying, but on the other hand, the Canadian population hearing all of this provocation, if you don't have political leaders from across the country responding to it, they're going to be going, what the are you doing?
Yeah.
Or not doing?
But you're responding to a hypothetical set of situations. Let's wait. No,
but they want to know that you're at least ready to meet the moment, right?
Well, okay, so
there was just to get in here, just to add a piece. I think there was a moment in which this started as a joke and then turned into not being a joke.
Right.
And I don't know what the collective we as this country did to provoke it, or if it's just Donald Trump. And so in some ways, I don't want to overanalyze the situation. But Trump is kind of like a guy who, goes to the comedy club, tries out 10 jokes, and if one of them had just a couple of smattering of laughs, just saying, let me try that one out again, see if it gets more engagement. Next time I go up on stage and throw out 51st State and it gets a bit more applause, throw out 51st State and gets a bit more. I feel like that's how he's kind of builds this thing, and at some point it turns serious. I don't think it's anything we did. I don't think us taking it seriously made it real. I think that's a self-fulfilling prophecy in its own right. We had no choice but to take it seriously. We have to have unified leadership on this file. So as much as I appreciate we could have been flippant, being like, yep, we'll take California and Vermont in exchange, sounds great. I think the cost would have been much higher. And we're still in this. I'm talking about this as if we're out of it. We're still very much in this. All of this is a live wire. We don't actually understand the motivations of Donald Trump per se as much as we can speculate. But I feel like taking it seriously is not a strategic mistake that we made.
So I'd say, look, I think it's pretty clear that the president-elect doesn't like the Prime Minister of Canada. And he believes that there were lots of things that following the last G8 or the last G7 that the Prime Minister took shots at him after he'd already left the G7. And so that anger that he has, it's directed at the PM. But the relationship, and David Cohen, the ambassador, spoken about this. He says the relationship is about more than just POTUS, the President of the United States, and the PM. It's not just about Ottawa and Washington. It's about Alberta and North Dakota and Michigan and Ontario, and it's about chambers of commerce, and it's about municipalities, and it's about unions that operate on both sides of the border, businesses on both sides of the border. We can survive this. This, like a kidney stone, will be painful, but it'll come to pass. And I think that we have to have the patience and forbearance not to do anything outrageous. And we should look at what happened in 1971 with the Nixon tariffs. They were put in place. They didn't last very long because the inflationary impact of those tariffs resulted in those tariffs being taken off in a matter of months.
Okay.
I'll just quickly add to that. As I agree with you, I think we're overreacting. I think there's a sense that there'll be 25% tariffs on January 21st, and that's not going to be the case.
Right.
And we've been acting as though that is the case,
right.
And I think it's been causing some alarmism. So I agree we're overreacting. We need maybe a less emotional response. But I do also think that we do want to see our leadership provide some clarity and some guidance on this when Canadians are feeling emotional and they are feeling fearful and they are feeling a bit unhinged. And who provided that this week? Stephen Harper, I have to say. And it resonated with me when he said, it doesn't feel like we're being treated like a partner or an ally or a friend. And some of the comments I've seen have been shocking. And I agree with that. And I think
people wanted to hear Danielle Smith say that. And we haven't heard
I
it.
think so too. And just the fact that we were all, that there was such an audience, such a thirst that was quenched to hear it from Stephen Harper. Is like wanting to have that as well to put out an adult in the room talking about this. Yes, it would have been nice to see that from Trudeau or Poilievre or Smith and a number of other people.
Right. So Danielle Smith, following her time at Mar-a-Lago and her brief meeting with Trump, did an avail, as we know, and she warned of a national unity crisis, right, after meeting with Donald Trump. And that obviously was centered around what we've been spending most of this podcast talking about. Are elements of that emerging? Because I hear two narratives on that too. One, that this has become unifying, and the other, that it is actually not unifying at all. It is the opposite of that. And that's where I want to end. Like, where are we right now? What moment are we in right now in this country? Zain?
I think we're gravitating towards unifying, and I feel like we would have been more closer to being unified if Danielle Smith had signed the communique. But there's a reason for that, not to rehash my points. I think it's because she could have brought up the grievances that historically the West and Alberta in particular have had with not just the federal government dusting off that old script, but with the other provinces and saying you have not been supportive. And this right now, this threat, whether we should take it seriously or not, right now demonstrates why we needed greater access for our energy, why we needed to build the infrastructure that this province and other federal governments have been advocating for decades. And so there could have been this position where we left that meeting, and maybe this sounds too hopeful, and Gary, as someone who's been in these meetings, can tell me that I'm being too naive and optimistic about the future. But I feel like we were on this pathway of unity in which both grievances could have been aired and commitments could have been made about the future and what direction and why we need to be unified in the face of this massive threat in front of us. All that being said, despite Smith being out on her own, I still feel like that unity message is winning over the divided message right now. Marginally, but I feel like that's the track and that's where the train is headed as we face this threat more so than not. Because I'll still say Danielle Smith has got an on-ramp to come back in. And Pierre Poilievre's got an on-ramp to come back in. The Canadian flag is available for anyone who wants to wrap themselves in it. I don't think this week has to be a defining triple down, double down moment for anybody. And I feel like the track that we're in is much more unified than it is divided at the moment.
Wow, I think I agree with that. I mean, look, I think that self-interest always leads to self-correction. And I'm an optimist as well about the nature of Canada and its ability to come together in times of crisis and do things that are in our collective best interest. And I think that there are on-ramps for all politicians, but there's got to be the ability to, particularly in the part of the federal government, to say, look, we have to be able to make compromises. We cannot disproportionately affect one part of the country with whatever it is that we do. And I think that if Premier Smith had that kind of assurance from a federal government partner, she'd say, okay, if it's not disproportionate, then I'm okay with this. And so I think
they said it was going to be proportionate, but I think that the truth is she doesn't trust them.
Well, would you
believe them?
I mean, would you? I mean, look at the track record.
Like if it was a Pierre Poilievre saying that, would she have responded differently?
Probably. Probably.
It'd be nice if Pierre Poilievre would say that, because then we'd be in a position that we could all get.
He'd have to be prime minister, though.
No.
No. If you're going to be the one in charge,
sure. But it would be nice if Pierre Poilievre, as leader of the opposition, were to say that, were to be on for the first time in a long time on the same page as Justin Trudeau, because this is about wrapping yourself in the Canadian flag, regardless of jersey color.
No, but my point.
Yeah.
But that's not my point, Zain. What I'm saying is, if he were the prime minister and in this moment, would she have had more confidence in his assurances that it would be proportionate?
Justin Trudeau is going to be the prime minister for 10 more minutes. She knows what's coming. Everyone can read the political tea leaves. So it's not like she needs Pierre Poilievre to be in the seat in order to know what's going to happen going forward, right? If she's thinking about this in the mid to long term, like she knows, just like everyone following politics, what the more than likely scenario of our federal politics looks like.
Okay. So getting back to the essence of my final question, what is the moment we're in, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think our leaders have wrapped themselves in glory this week or these last 2 months. But I do think there has been something sparked in Canadians that bodes well for the future. The tariffs are one thing and Trump is one thing. But we have been complacent. We have been a complacent people, surely for the last decade, and it's been easy just to trade with the United States, and and things have fallen a little bit apart under our watch. And I think we've been shaken out of our complacency, at the very least. And the next government and the provincial governments will all have a lot more leash to do things a little bit more robustly, a little bit more ambitiously, because the status quo clearly is not in our interests anymore. So beyond the tariffs, I think there is, I'm much more hopeful about the ability of this country to build, to want to build things, to remove barriers to building, to focus on economic growth, to be strong with or without the United States, regardless of what Trump does, to make ourselves stronger and to use our many tools that we are blessed with in this country to make ourselves stronger and withstand whatever trade relationship we happen to have with the United States. So at the end of the day, you know, it might take a few months, but I think overall this will be positive for Canada in the medium term.
Okay.
Look, I want to go away from Castaway Island and talk more about Zain's idea of everybody wearing the same jersey. So I like that metaphor a lot better.
Yeah.
Okay. On that just seems like a perfect place to conclude. Zain, look at you, Zain.
So happy.
Naming podcasts. I mean,
Just
Well, he was inspired by Mark Carney the other day. You know, so there you have it. It's all hockey analogies.
we did have another
if there was
title, but
too many hockey analogies, I would say.
we did have another title, but you're going to have to wait and see when we post the pod which one we went with. But I don't know. You made a pretty good case. Everyone seemed to embrace it. Zain, thank you very much. Gary, as always. And Heather, so glad to have you on the pod. I hope you come back again.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.